The screaming started before the sun cleared the tree line. 800 voices, maybe more. The sound tore through the jungle like something alive, something with teeth rolling up the slope toward the Marine positions dug into the ridge above Henderson Field. It was late October, 1942, and on Guadalcanal, that sound meant one thing: a Banzai charge. Dozens of Japanese soldiers sprinting through the undergrowth with fixed bayonets closing the distance at 10 miles per hour. Each man prepared to die as long as he took an American with him. Sergeant Earl Braddock did not reach for his M1 Garand, the rifle he had carried for 2 months through this green hell. The rifle that had kept him alive through Edson's Ridge and the Matanacao River crossings, the rifle he trusted more than any human being on this island sat strapped across his back. In his hands was something else entirely: a Winchester Model 97 pump-action shotgun, 12 gauge. 5 shells in the magazine tube, 1 in the chamber. A weapon the United States Marine Corps had nearly thrown in the garbage. 3 weeks earlier, Braddock had called it a useless relic, a museum piece, a joke from his father's war that had no business on a modern battlefield. He raised it toward the first shadow bursting through the ferns at 40 yards and pulled the trigger. 3 men fell at once, and everything Earl Braddock thought he knew about warfare changed in the space of a single heartbeat. That shot did not kill 1 man. It killed 3. And it came from a gun the American military almost discarded, a forgotten leftover from the trenches of France 25 years earlier. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand who Earl Braddock was and why this weapon ended up in his hands instead of in a scrap heap. To understand Earl Braddock, you have to understand McDowell County, West Virginia. In the 1930s, it was one of the poorest places in the United States. Children went into the coal mines at 14. Men coughed black dust into rags and called it living. The average life expectancy for a miner barely touched 50, and most families measured time not in years, but in the intervals between funerals. Earl grew up in that world. His mother took in laundry. His older brother worked the night shift at the Pocahontas No. 4 mine before he was old enough to drive. And his father, Harold Braddock, was a man whose body was slowly being eaten alive by the very mountain that fed his family. Harold had served in the Great War. He shipped overseas with the 26th Infantry Division, the Yankee Division, and fought through the Meuse-Argonne Offensive in the autumn of 1918. He came home with 2 things: a pair of lungs that would never work right again, and a collection of stories about the trenches that he told every Saturday evening on the front porch, a glass of cheap whiskey sweating in his hand. The stories always ended the same way. In the trenches, rifles were useless, son. Too long, too slow. But the shotgun, Harold would raise one hand and mime the pump action, his wrist snapping forward and back with a precision that 20 years of coal dust had not dulled. The shotgun was the only thing that kept me alive. The Germans were so scared of it, they tried to get it banned. Banned. A gun. In a war. Then he would laugh, and the laugh would become a cough, and the cough would go on until his eyes turned red and watery. Earl remembered one detail more clearly than all the rest. One night, Harold reached into his shirt pocket and produced a small piece of metal corroded and slightly bent. He held it up to the porch light. "This is the casing from the first shotgun shell I ever fired in combat. Argonne Forest. October 1918. I kept it because it reminds me that there are moments when only this," and he closed his fist around the fragment, "stands between you and dying." Harold placed the shell casing on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, where it sat for the rest of Earl's childhood, like a small mysterious relic that the boy never fully understood. Harold Braddock died of black lung disease in 1938. He was 43 years old. His last words to his son were not about love or family or the things that dying men are supposed to say. They were about a weapon. "Remember the shotgun, son. When everything else fails, it won't." Earl thought it was the rambling of a man whose mind was going. 2 years later, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps and never thought about the shotgun again. Until today. Braddock arrived on Guadalcanal in August 1942 with the 1st Marine Division during the initial landings. By late October, he had survived 2 months of the most brutal combat the Pacific Theater had yet produced. He fought through the Japanese counterattacks at Edson's Ridge, also known as Bloody Ridge, where 1,000 enemy soldiers charged Marine positions in waves throughout the night. He survived the engagements along the Matanacao River. He watched the Ichiki detachment throw itself against American lines with a ferocity that defied every rational calculation of survival. In those 2 months, Braddock lost 4 men from his squad in a single night. Not because his Marines could not shoot, because at 30 yards in dense jungle rifles simply were not fast enough. An M1 Garand was accurate out to 300 yards or more. At 30 yards through a wall of mahogany trees and sword ferns, that accuracy was meaningless. What mattered was speed and spread, and the rifle had neither. Then Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hargrove made a decision that would change everything. Hargrove was 45 years old, West Point educated, and the kind of officer who made decisions based on numbers, not instinct. After reviewing casualty reports from multiple Banzai charge encounters, he identified a pattern that disturbed him. 78% of American casualties occurred at distances under 50 yards. At those distances, the M1 Garand's precision was wasted. Its 8-round clip emptied too quickly, and the narrow window between the enemy reaching effective range and overrunning the position left no margin for error. Hargrove remembered something from the old reports. First World War assessments of shotgun effectiveness in trench warfare. Weapons that fired 9 lead pellets in a spreading pattern. Weapons that did not require precise aim. Weapons that the German Empire had formally protested as barbaric and tried to have banned under the Hague Convention. If the enemy wanted it banned, Hargrove reasoned it must have been extraordinarily effective. He ordered a batch of Winchester Model 97 trench guns distributed to selected squads for field evaluation. Braddock's squad was one of them. The reaction was immediate and negative. Braddock held the shotgun for the first time and felt its unfamiliar weight distribution heavier at the front, shorter than the Garand with the pump mechanism that felt clunky and primitive compared to the smooth semi-automatic action he had trained on for months. The magazine held 5 shells. 5, compared to the Garand's 8 rounds. At a moment when every bullet mattered, the Marine Corps was giving him fewer of them. 5 rounds for 60 Japanese soldiers, Braddock said to no one in particular. The math doesn't work. Most of the squad agreed. They grumbled. They questioned Hargrove's judgment behind his back. They kept their Garands close and treated the shotguns like unwanted furniture. Everyone except Corporal Ray Pulaski. Pulaski was 30 years old from Houma, Louisiana, deep in the bayou country, where the line between land and water was a matter of opinion, and everything from houses to people to animals lived half submerged. Before the war, Pulaski trapped alligators and hunted ducks in marshes, where visibility rarely exceeded 20 yards, and your target appeared and vanished in the time it took to blink. He had been using pump-action shotguns since he was 12 years old. When the rest of the squad complained about their new weapons, Pulaski sat quietly and cleaned his Winchester with the unhurried ease of a man reuniting with an old friend. When Braddock challenged the logic of 5 rounds against a human wave attack, Pulaski looked up and said something that the sergeant would remember for the rest of his life. In the swamp, you don't aim. You point and you shoot. The jungle works the same way. Then he did the math that Braddock had failed to consider. Each shotgun shell contained 9 pellets of double-aught buckshot. 5 shells meant 45 individual projectiles. At 30 yards, each shot spread into a pattern roughly 10 feet wide. At that distance, every trigger pull was almost guaranteed to hit 2 or 3 men simultaneously. 12 Marines, 5 shells each meant 540 projectiles, creating a wall of lead across a front where the enemy had no room to dodge. Your math is for rifles, Pulaski said. Shotgun math is different. Do it again. Braddock did the calculation that night lying in his foxhole with rain starting to tap against the palm leaves overhead. And for the first time, the numbers made a different kind of sense. But he still was not convinced. Pulaski became the squad's unofficial instructor during the 3 weeks before the battle. He taught them principles that no Marine Corps manual had ever contained, knowledge passed down through generations of Louisiana hunters who understood close-range shooting the way coal miners understood rock. The first principle was pointing instead of aiming. A rifle required you to align the front sight, the rear sight, and the target in a precise mechanical sequence. In the time that process took a charging enemy covered 5 yards. A shotgun required something different. You used your whole body to direct the weapon toward the threat and fired on instinct. There was no time for sights, only direction and speed. The second principle was never letting the weapon run empty. Pulaski taught a technique from duck hunting fire: 3 rounds immediately reload, 2 continue firing. The weapon always held at least 2 or 3 shells ready. You never reached the terrifying moment of an empty gun with enemies still coming. Private Tommy Kowalski learned this technique faster than anyone else in the squad. Kowalski was 19 years old, the son of a Polish immigrant steelworker from Youngstown, Ohio. His father worked at Republic Steel. His mother worked at the laundry. 6 people in a 3-room apartment, the sound of the stamping press audible from morning until night. Tommy had dropped out of high school to enlist the day after Pearl Harbor, one of thousands of American boys not yet old enough to drink, but old enough to carry a rifle into the jungle. He arrived on Guadalcanal as a replacement in October 1942, filling a slot left by a dead man. He had never seen real combat. But Braddock noticed something about the kid. He learned fast, and he never complained. While veteran Marines struggled to unlearn their rifle habits, Kowalski started from zero. He had no old instincts to break. The shotgun became part of his body within days, and he developed the 3-2 reload technique into a fluid rhythm that maintained continuous firepower without conscious thought. The third principle Pulaski taught was teamwork. 2 Marines working together, one firing while the other reloaded, created an unbroken stream of buckshot that no gap in individual firepower could interrupt. He called it the buddy reload, and it would prove decisive in the weeks ahead. During the second week of training, something shifted inside Braddock. It was small, almost invisible, but Pulaski noticed. The squad was running a drill simulating a Banzai charge at close range, firing at clusters of palm fronds set up as targets at 30 yards. Braddock fired his shotgun and watched the spread of 9 pellets shred every frond in a 10-foot arc. With a rifle, he would have hit one, maybe missed entirely if a single branch deflected his round. He stood there for a long moment looking at the destruction his single trigger pull had caused. Then he looked down at the Winchester in his hands. Something in his expression changed, a flicker of recognition that Pulaski had been waiting 3 days to see. "The old man wasn't crazy after all," Braddock said quietly. Pulaski did not reply. He just smiled and went back to loading shells. But the doubt had not fully died. That night, Braddock sat in his foxhole doing arithmetic on a scrap of paper by candlelight. 9 pellets per shell, 5 shells per reload, 45 projectiles per magazine, 12 Marines each with 25 shells total. He multiplied and added and crossed out numbers and started again. The figures kept arriving at the same conclusion. At jungle ranges, the shotgun produced a density of fire that no number of rifles could match. "Your math is for rifles," Pulaski had told him. "Shotgun math is different." Braddock was finally beginning to see what that meant. But beginning to see was not the same as believing entirely. He still kept his M1 Garand strapped to his back, just in case. To understand why Banzai charges worked and why the shotgun was about to change everything, you need to understand the mathematics of jungle combat. A Banzai charge moved at roughly 10 miles per hour through dense vegetation. At 50 yards, the closing time was approximately 10 to 15 seconds. During that window, a skilled Marine with an M1 Garand could fire 3 to 4 accurate shots under jungle conditions. 12 rifles meant perhaps 36 to 48 shots. With a hit rate around 40% in dense undergrowth that produced 15 to 20 casualties. But if 60 to 80 men were charging, 40 to 60 would reach the American line. And it only took 10 to breach a defensive position. This was the equation that had killed Marines across the Solomon Islands, and no one had solved it. Until a West Point officer read a report from 1918, and a Louisiana duck hunter taught a squad of skeptical Marines how to point instead of aim. Late October 1942. Dawn. Braddock's 12-man squad held a section of ridge overlooking a valley choked with mahogany trees and dense undergrowth near Henderson Field. They were part of the defensive perimeter during one of the largest Japanese offensives of the campaign, a coordinated assault by elements of the Sendai Division, one of the Imperial Japanese Army's most elite units. 600 to 800 enemy soldiers were attacking along the entire line. Braddock's sector would face 60 to 80 of them. The jungle went silent first. That was always the warning. Birds stopped singing. Insects stopped buzzing. Every living creature in the canopy sensed the mass of human bodies moving through the undergrowth below and went quiet. Braddock had learned to read this signal over 2 months. Silence in the jungle was never peaceful. Silence meant something terrible was about to happen. Through his binoculars, he counted the forming ranks. Japanese soldiers carrying Arisaka, Type 99 rifles with fixed bayonets, moving with the disciplined precision of men who had rehearsed this maneuver dozens of times. They spread across a wide front at 400 yards, but Braddock could see what would happen as they advanced. The dense vegetation would funnel them into natural corridors, pathways through the undergrowth no wider than 20 to 30 yards. Kill zones. He positioned his squad accordingly. Kowalski and 2 others covering the main approach. Pulaski at a secondary choke point where the terrain created a corridor barely 30 yards wide. Pulaski settled into position with the calm of a man sitting in a flat-bottom boat on a Louisiana marsh, waiting for ducks to come in over the decoys. The charge began with the sound that had haunted American forces since Pearl Harbor. Hundreds of voices screaming in unison. Not a war cry born of rage, but a battle shout of absolute commitment, the sound of men who had accepted death and wanted only to take their enemies with them. Kowalski called the ranges. 300 yards and closing fast, Sergeant. His voice was steady despite his age. 200. 100. At 75 yards, the jungle did exactly what Braddock had predicted. The vegetation compressed the Japanese formation into the corridor, soldiers crowding together along the only passable routes. At 50 yards, Braddock could see their faces. Young. Most of them younger than Kowalski. Their expressions carried something he had learned to recognize over 2 months. Not fury, not madness. A calm acceptance that they were going to die combined with an absolute determination to take someone with them. His hand went to his chest pocket. Through the fabric, he felt the small shape of Harold's shell casing the corroded fragment from the Argonne Forest 1918. He had carried it from West Virginia without knowing why. A dead man's keepsake. A relic from a war that seemed as distant as a fairy tale. Then he raised the Winchester Model 97, 40 yards. Braddock squeezed the trigger. The 12-gauge shell launched 9 lead pellets in a spreading fan. At that distance, the pattern had expanded to roughly 6 to 8 feet wide. The pellets struck not just the man he had aimed at, but the 2 soldiers running on either side. All 3 dropped instantly, their forward momentum converted into a sudden terrible stillness. And in that fraction of a second, between the thunderclap of the shot and the smooth forward snap of the pump action chambering a fresh round, Earl Braddock understood. Not with his mind, with his body. This weapon did not need him to be precise. It only needed him to point in the right direction, exactly as Pulaski had said. You point and you shoot. Pump. Second shot. 2 more fell. Pump. Third shot punched through a curtain of leaves that would have deflected a rifle bullet, completely striking 2 Japanese soldiers. Braddock could barely see through the foliage. Pump. Fourth shot. Kowalski opened fire from the main trail. Each blast of 12-gauge buckshot sounded nothing like a rifle. Not the sharp crack of a Garand, but a deep thunderous boom that echoed through the jungle like miniature artillery. The psychological effect was immediate. Japanese soldiers trained to absorb rifle fire found themselves facing a weapon they could not comprehend. The spreading pellets made cover irrelevant. Tree trunks that shielded a man from a bullet offered no protection against 9 projectiles arriving from slightly different angles. Vegetation that blocked aimed rifle shots merely scattered the buckshot into wider, more unpredictable patterns. Pulaski at his secondary choke point fired twice into a group of 6 soldiers, funneling through the narrow corridor. Double-aught buckshot at 25 yards. All 6 went down in under 3 seconds. Pulaski did not change expression. For him, this was duck hunting. The ducks were just bigger. The effect on the Japanese formation was devastating. Their troops had trained extensively to recognize the distinctive sounds of American weapons and exploit their weaknesses. They knew the EM-1 Garand's 8-round clip made a distinctive metallic ping when it ejected empty, and they had learned to time their final rushes to that sound, charging during the seconds when American Marines were reloading. But the continuous boom of pump-action shotguns produced no such signal. There was no ping, no pause, no exploitable gap. Just thunder over and over with no indication of when it would stop. The coordinated charge dissolved into scattered groups of men stumbling through increasingly deadly terrain. The engagement lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds from first contact to withdrawal. When the smoke cleared and the jungle settled back into its normal sounds, Braddock's squad counted 23 confirmed Japanese casualties. The average for a rifle-equipped squad in similar Banzai encounters was 4 to 6. Marine casualties stood at 0, dead 2, lightly wounded. In previous engagements of this kind, the average was 2 to 3 killed per squad. Braddock sat down behind a fallen mahogany trunk. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the magnitude of what had just happened. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out Harold's shell casing, the small piece of corroded metal from the Argonne Forest 1918. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling the rough edges that 24 years of handling had not smoothed. For the first time in his life, he wanted to talk to his father, but Harold had been dead for 4 years. "You were right, Dad," Braddock whispered. No one heard him. But it was the moment when the boy from West Virginia finally believed the old man's stories. Lieutenant Colonel Hargrove reviewed the after-action report and recognized immediately that this was not an isolated success. The numbers represented a fundamental shift in everything the Marine Corps assumed about infantry weapons and jungle warfare. Engagement duration had dropped from the typical 8 to 12 minutes with rifles to under 4 minutes. The ammunition-to-casualty ratio showed dramatic improvement, 12 shotgun shells per confirmed enemy casualty compared to 60 to 80 rifle rounds. Most critically, 93% of shotgun casualties showed immediate incapacitation, meaning the wounded enemy could not continue advancing with the bayonet long enough to reach American positions. With rifles, many Japanese soldiers struck by a single bullet continued their charge for several more seconds, often long enough to kill. Hargrove began drafting his recommendation for expanded distribution, but the data alone did not capture the full picture. Interrogation of Japanese prisoners captured after the engagement revealed something unexpected. They called the trench guns Raiju thunder guns. Prisoners described panic spreading through their formation as the weapon's distinctive sound overwhelmed their training. One captured officer admitted that the metallic sound of the pump-action cycling created more terror than the blast itself because the pump sound was specific and unmistakable. It meant the next shot was already loaded. There was no gap to exploit, no moment of vulnerability. This was the first sign of something that would grow much larger, the enemy acknowledging in their own words that a weapon the American military had almost discarded was the most frightening thing they had encountered in the Pacific. But Braddock barely had time to absorb what had happened. Pulaski was cleaning his shotgun on the ridge, looking south toward the ocean, where dark clouds were stacking up along the horizon like a wall. "In the Louisiana Bayou," Pulaski said quietly, "water is the worst enemy a shotgun has, and I have a feeling this place is worse than any bayou." Braddock looked at the clouds. He knew what was coming. Monsoon season on Guadalcanal was not rain the way Americans understood rain. It was a curtain of water that fell continuously for days, turning every metal surface to rust and every wooden stock to pulp. The weapon that had just saved their lives was about to face a test that no trench in France had ever prepared it for. The rain arrived on the third week of November like a punishment from a god who had run out of patience. It did not fall. It poured. It hammered. It came down in sheets so thick that a man could extend his arm and lose sight of his own hand. The temperature stayed at 95 degrees and the humidity climbed to 100%, which meant the air itself was water. Every breath felt like drowning. Clothes never dried. Skin went soft and white from constant moisture. Every scratch, every insect bite, every minor wound turned septic. Within hours, the flesh swelling red and hot before most men even noticed the cut. Guadalcanal in monsoon season was a place where the human body began to destroy itself. And it was not just bodies. Weapons suffered too. Sergeant Earl Braddock discovered the fatal weakness of the trench gun in the worst possible circumstances. His squad was running a routine patrol through the lowland trails south of Henderson Field when Japanese sniper fire cracked through the canopy. Braddock dropped behind a rotting log, brought the Winchester Model 97 up to his shoulder, and racked the pump action. Nothing happened. The mechanism locked solid. Not a soft jam that a sharp pull could fix. A dead lock as though someone had poured cement into the receiver. The weapon that had saved his life 2 weeks earlier was now a 6-pound piece of useless steel. Braddock felt a cold shock travel from his hands up through his chest as rifle rounds snapped through the leaves above his head. He dropped the shotgun and drew his Colt in 1911 sidearm, returning fire with the pistol, while his primary weapon lay in the mud beside him like a broken promise. They survived the ambush. Barely. But when the squad regrouped on the ridge that evening, Braddock found that his was not the only failure. Within 48 hours of continuous rainfall, half the shotguns in his 12-man squad were experiencing malfunctions. Every weapon had a different problem. Extractors jamming, magazine tube springs weakening, trigger assemblies failing to engage cleanly. This was not a single component failure. It was systemic. Moisture was destroying everything at once. Pulaski did not panic. He did not complain. He sat down in the rain with his back against a tree trunk and began disassembling every shotgun in the squad, one at a time, laying the parts out on a poncho like a surgeon preparing instruments. What he found changed everything. The standard Marine Corps lubricant, the oil prescribed in every maintenance manual issued by every training depot in the United States, was the problem. In the tropical humidity of Guadalcanal, the oil attracted dirt, sand, and microscopic debris from the jungle floor. These particles mixed with the lubricant and formed an abrasive paste that ground between every moving part, locking them together with the friction of wet sandpaper. The more faithfully a Marine followed the official maintenance procedure, the faster his weapon failed. Less oil was better. No oil at all was better still. This was the kind of lesson that a classroom could never teach. The procedures had been written by men who tested weapons in temperate climates on clean firing ranges under controlled conditions that bore no resemblance to a tropical jungle where the air was soup and the ground was mud. Those procedures were killing Marines as surely as enemy bullets. Pulaski knew this already. He had known it for years. In the Louisiana Bayou, every shotgunner learned the same lesson by the time he was 15. All makes a shotgun stick in wet air. Dry is better. Wax is better than oil. And the simpler the mechanism, the fewer places moisture can hide. He developed a 4-step field maintenance protocol that violated every line of the official manual, but worked. First, complete disassembly after every patrol. Second, wipe every surface dry with cloth, no oil whatsoever. Third, apply a thin coat of beeswax sourced from local villagers to the metal contact points, creating a moisture barrier that did not attract debris. Fourth, store ammunition in improvised waterproof pouches made from oiled cloth and wax. The malfunction rate dropped from 23% to roughly 8 to 10%. Not perfect, but enough to maintain a fighting capability. Pulaski began recording every step in a small notebook that he kept wrapped in waxed cloth inside his shirt. Other squads heard about his methods and sent men to learn. Within 2 weeks, Pulaski's unofficial maintenance manual was being copied by hand across the 1st Marine Division, passed from squad to squad like a family recipe for something that kept you alive. The knowledge of a duck hunter from the Louisiana Bayou was spreading through the United States Marine Corps by word of mouth. But the mechanical problems were only half the crisis. The ammunition was failing too. Shotgun shells of that era used cardboard hulls coated in wax. In the relentless tropical moisture, the wax coating broke down within 2 weeks, softening and peeling away from the cardboard like dead skin. Once exposed, the cardboard absorbed water like a sponge. Wet shells produced inconsistent chamber pressure. The powder charge designed to ignite at a precise rate and generate a specific force became unpredictable. Some rounds fired normally. Some produced a weak muffled report and sent their pellets tumbling uselessly to the ground 15 yards from the muzzle, as harmless as thrown pebbles. Some did not fire at all, the primer clicking dead under the firing pin, with a sound that was somehow worse than an explosion, because silence meant nothing was happening and everything was wrong. Braddock experienced 3 ammunition failures during a single firefight in late November. The first shell produced a sound like a cough instead of a blast, its pellets dropping harmlessly short. The second was a complete misfire, the primer clicking dead under the firing pin. The third detonated at reduced power, scattering its buckshot in a pattern so wide and weak that it would not have stopped a charging dog, let alone a Japanese soldier with a bayonet. 3 failures in 1 engagement, at the exact moment when every round was the difference between life and death. Across the division, the numbers told a grim story. Malfunction rates climbed to 23% during extended wet operations. 4 Marines and other units were wounded because their weapons failed during enemy contact. One of those men died 3 days later from wound infection in the tropical heat, turning a mechanical jam into a death. Morale crumbled. Marines who had felt invincible with their Thunder guns 2 weeks earlier now carried M1 Garands as backup despite the extra 10 pounds of weight. The psychology shifted from, "I trust this weapon," to, "I cannot afford to trust this weapon." Some men carried both the shotgun and the rifle, staggering under the combined load through knee-deep mud, unwilling to commit to either. Braddock faced the question that would define everything that followed. Had the weapon failed, or had the system failed? The weapon. Then came the night that almost broke Tommy Kowalski. Late November. A night patrol along the river south of the airfield. Kowalski was on point, moving through waist-high ferns in darkness so complete that he navigated by sound and touch. Japanese soldiers had been probing the perimeter for days, and the squad was tasked with intercepting a suspected infiltration route. They walked into an ambush at 30 yards. Muzzle flashes erupted from 3 positions simultaneously. Kowalski dropped to one knee and racked his shotgun. It fired. He racked again. It fired. He racked a 3rd time, and the pump locked dead. The same cement feeling Braddock had described. The weapon froze in his hands while enemy fire tore through the vegetation around him. He transitioned to his sidearm, but the seconds he lost clearing the malfunction had consequences. A Japanese soldier reached grenade range. The explosion sent fragments tearing through the fern cover, and a man in Kowalski's squad took shrapnel across his left side. Not fatal, but serious enough to require evacuation. A wound that would not have happened if Kowalski's third shot had fired. The aftermath was worse than the ambush itself. Kowalski stopped eating. He stopped talking. He began carrying both the shotgun and an M1 Garand on every patrol, the combined weight grinding him into the mud, as though punishing his own body could undo what had happened. The 19-year-old who had adapted to the shotgun faster than any veteran in the squad now refused to trust. It refused to trust himself. Refused to believe that the choice of weapon had not been his fault. Guilt is a corrosive thing. It eats from inside the way the tropical humidity ate the metal of their guns. Braddock recognized what was happening because he had seen it before. Men who blamed themselves for the random cruelty of combat. Men who replayed a single moment over and over, convinced that a different choice would have produced a different outcome. The truth was uglier and simpler in war. Sometimes the equipment fails and people get hurt, and there is no amount of skill or courage that changes that arithmetic. But Braddock did not say that to Kowalski. Instead, he told him something Harold Braddock had said on a winter morning in West Virginia when Earl was 14 and had nearly broken his arm using the wrong technique to swing a mine pick. In the coal mine, it is not the pick that is bad. It is that you have not learned how to use it in the right conditions. Harold had not blamed the tool. He had not blamed the boy. He had pointed at the gap between the two and said that is where the problem lives. Not in the pick, not in your hands. In the fact that you are using a technique meant for soft rock on a seam of hard anthracite. Braddock sat next to Kowalski in the dark and said the same thing in different words. The gun did not jam because it is a bad weapon. It jammed because we were maintaining it wrong. Your squad mate did not get hurt because you chose the wrong gun. He got hurt because none of us knew how to keep this thing running in this environment. That is not your fault. That is a lesson. And lessons are what keep us alive tomorrow. He paused. The rain drummed on the broad leaves above them, steady and indifferent. The sound of an island that did not care whether they lived or died. Listen to me, Kowalski. I carried that same guilt after Henderson Field. I lost 4 men in one night and spent weeks thinking about what I could have done different. Could I have positioned them better? Could I have fired faster? Could I have seen the charge coming sooner? You know what I learned. That guilt does not bring them back. And guilt does not stop the next charge. The only thing that stops the next charge is learning from what went wrong and making sure it does not happen again. Kowalski did not reply immediately. He sat in the mud, his back against a coconut palm, both weapons across his knees. The shotgun on the left, the Garand on the right. 2 guns for a man who could not decide which one to trust. Then slowly, he nodded. Not a dramatic gesture. Just a small movement of his head that said, I hear you. I am not all the way back yet, but I hear you. Something in Kowalski's expression shifted. Not a dramatic transformation. Not a Hollywood moment where music swells and a man finds his courage. Just a slight loosening around the eyes, a fractional release of the tension he had been carrying in his jaw for days. It was enough. Healing in combat does not happen in single moments. It happens in fractions, in small surrenders of the weight a man carries 1 ounce at a time. That same night, Braddock made a decision that the rest of the squad noticed. He unstrapped his M1 Garand, the rifle he had carried as a backup since the shotguns were issued, the rifle that represented his last thread of connection to the way things used to be. He set it down against a tree, leaned it there the way you lean a broom against a wall when you are done sweeping, and he walked away. From that point forward, Earl Braddock carried only the shotgun. No backup, no safety net. Full commitment to the weapon his father had told him about on a porch in West Virginia, and that a duck hunter from Louisiana had taught him to trust. It was a small gesture. 6 pounds of steel and wood leaning against a tree in the rain. But the squad saw it. Every man saw it. And the message was louder than anything Braddock could have said with words. If the sergeant trusts this weapon with his life, despite its flaws, despite the rain, despite everything that has gone wrong, then maybe the problem really is not the gun. Maybe the problem is everything around the gun. And maybe that is something we can fix. Meanwhile, Pulaski's role had expanded far beyond his rank. Other squads sent men to consult him. Officers who outranked him by 3 grades sat in the mud, while a corporal from Houma, Louisiana, explained how beeswax worked better than military specification lubricant. There was something almost comical about it. The most valuable tactical knowledge in the 1st Marine Division was coming from a man whose pre-war expertise was shooting ducks and trapping alligators. Lieutenant Colonel Hargrove recognized what was happening and did something unusual for a West Point officer. He invited Pulaski directly to a staff meeting, bypassing the entire chain of command to brief senior officers on field maintenance procedures. A corporal standing in front of colonels and majors, mud still caked on his boots, explaining in a Louisiana drawl why everything they had been taught about weapon maintenance was wrong for this theater of operations. Some officers bristled at the sight of an enlisted man lecturing them. Others leaned forward with the focused attention of men who understood that rank means nothing when the man with the lowest stripes has the knowledge that keeps people alive. The manual was written for Virginia and North Carolina. Pulaski said his voice, the same flat calm he used whether he was discussing beeswax or describing a firefight. This is not Virginia. This is the inside of a boiling pot. You cannot treat a weapon the same way in a boiling pot as you do on a clean range in Quantico. Hargrove incorporated Pulaski's protocols into his official report. For the first time, the combat knowledge of an enlisted Bayou hunter was codified in Marine Corps documentation. The gap between textbook and battlefield was being closed by a man who had never read the textbook. Then intelligence delivered a discovery that transformed the shotgun from a successful experiment into something that shook the enemy's strategic planning at its foundation. Documents recovered from the body of a dead Japanese officer contained tactical instructions that had been distributed to frontline units throughout the Solomon Islands. The pages were water-stained and partially illegible, but the translators at division headquarters pieced together enough to understand what they were reading, and what they found sent a ripple through the command structure. The text described a specific counter to American rifle fire that had been standard Japanese doctrine for months. Soldiers were trained to count the 8 shots of an M1 Garand and listen for the distinctive metallic ping of the empty clip ejecting. That sound, that small, bright, unmistakable ping, meant the American was reloading. That sound was the signal to charge. The document included detailed instructions on timing spacing and the precise number of seconds between the ping and the moment a Marine could fire again. The document then contained a section marked with urgency. It addressed the shotgun directly. The enemy's shotgun weapon designated Raiju presents no exploitable firing pause. Continuous fire capability eliminates the reloading gap that our assault timing depends upon. New assault methods must be developed. Braddock read the translation twice. The Japanese military had developed an entire tactical doctrine built around the 8-round limitation of the M1 Garand. They had studied American weapons, identified their vulnerability, and trained their soldiers to exploit the exact moment when Marines were most defenseless. It had worked. Across the Pacific, that technique had contributed to the success of Banzai charges that overran position after position, and a pump-action shotgun from 1918 had destroyed it completely. This was enemy validation on a level that went beyond frightened prisoners using colorful nicknames. This was a formal tactical document written by officers for soldiers acknowledging that a weapon the American military had almost thrown away required the Japanese Imperial Army to redesign its close assault doctrine from the ground up. When the enemy writes it into their training manuals, it is no longer opinion. It is official admission. The second test of the trench gun came during a heavy rain engagement in early December. A Banzai charge of 40 to 50 Japanese soldiers hit the perimeter during a downpour so intense that visibility dropped to under 30 yards. Conditions were terrible. 2 of the squad's shotguns jammed within the first minute. Marines on those weapons transitioned to sidearms while their partners maintained fire with functioning shotguns, executing the buddy reload technique Pulaski had taught them weeks earlier. It was not clean. It was not elegant. 2/3 of the shotguns worked, and the squad adapted around the failures. Kowalski's weapon functioned throughout the engagement, and for the first time since the night ambush, the young Marine from Ohio fired with confidence rather than fear. The decisive moment came midway through the fight. Pulaski's shotgun jammed after 3 rounds. The pump locked forward, refusing to cycle. A Japanese soldier was 15 yards away and closing. Without hesitation, without a flicker of panic, without even a change in his breathing. Pulaski pressed the action release button with his thumb, slapped the pump forward with the heel of his left hand, and cycled a fresh round into the chamber. 3 seconds. The weapon roared again before the nearest Japanese soldier had covered 5 yards. The man fell 10 yards from Pulaski's position. Kowalski watched those 3 seconds from 10 feet away. He would remember them for the rest of his life. 3 seconds was the distance between death and survival, and Pulaski had crossed it not because the weapon was perfect, but because he knew what to do when it was not. In the swamp, Pulaski had said, "You learn that nothing works right all the time. Boats leak, Traps fail. Guns jam. What matters is not whether things go wrong. What matters is what you do in the 3 seconds after they go wrong. That was the real lesson. Not that the gun would never fail, but that a man who understood his weapon completely, who had spent years learning its moods and limits, the way a horseman learns a difficult animal, could survive its failures and keep fighting. The squad repelled the attack. Not as cleanly as the first engagement. There were light casualties, but the outcome was significantly better than any rifle-equipped unit achieved along the same perimeter that night. Hargrove's after-action data confirmed what Braddock's squad had demonstrated. Even with a 23% malfunction rate, shotgun-equipped units suffered 40% fewer casualties than rifle units during Banzai charge engagements. The weapon was imperfect, but it was still superior. Hargrove completed his recommendation report for expanded trench gun distribution. It included tactical employment guidelines, ammunition consumption analysis, casualty ratio comparisons, and Pulaski's field maintenance protocols. He wrote in the conclusion, "This weapon is not the perfect solution. It has clear limitations in range reliability under adverse weather and maintenance requirements that exceed standard rifles. But in the close-range combat conditions we face in the Pacific, it is the most effective tool available to us. The problem is not the weapon. The problem is how we support it." The report went to division headquarters. The trench gun program would continue and expand. February 1945. More than 2 years after Guadalcanal, Earl Braddock stood on the deck of a transport ship, gripping the rail with both hands, staring at an island that looked like it belonged on another planet. Iwo Jima. A small pear-shaped volcanic rock rising from the Pacific, pumping sulfur smoke into a gray sky from vents that dotted its surface like open wounds. The smell reached the ship before the island's full shape became clear. Rotten eggs, sulfur, and something chemical and ancient that burned the inside of the nose. There was no green anywhere. No jungle. No trees. No birds. Just black sand, rocky outcroppings, concrete blockhouses, and smoke. After 2 years of fighting in green jungles thick with life, Iwo Jima looked like the earth had died and been left to rot in the sun. Kowalski stood beside him, 21 years old now. His face had hardened over 2 years of island combat, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, and a dozen smaller actions that no one back home would ever hear about. The 19-year-old steelworker's son from Ohio was gone. In his place was a Marine whose eyes moved constantly, cataloging threats in every shadow, every sound, every shift in the wind. Pulaski checked his shotgun, the same Winchester Model 97 that had followed him from Guadalcanal through every island in the chain. He ran his thumb along the receiver, feeling the wear marks and small dents that mapped 2 years of combat like scars on skin. "Swamp jungle rain?" Pulaski said. "This gun survived all of it, but I have never taken it into a volcano." Braddock reached into his chest pocket and felt the shape of Harold's shell casing, the corroded fragment from the Argonne Forest. Here in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, looking at a volcanic island that smelled like rotten eggs, he remembered his father sitting on the porch in West Virginia, talking about trenches. The whiskey glass sweating in Harold's hand, the cough that followed every laugh, the way he mimed the pump action with a wrist that 20 years of coal dust had not dulled. In the trenches, rifles were useless, Harold had said. And what was Iwo Jima? If not an island made entirely of trenches, Japanese General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had forbidden Banzai charges on Iwo Jima. Instead, he had built 11 miles of interconnected tunnels and bunkers, turning the entire island into an underground fortress where every corridor was a trench and every engagement happened at 5 to 15 yards. The exact distance where a shotgun was the deadliest weapon a man could carry. The weapon designed for the trenches of France in 1918 was about to enter the tunnel systems of Japan in 1945. The circle was closing. Braddock did not know it yet, but his father had been telling him the ending of this story since he was a boy, sitting on a porch in McDowell County, listening to a dying man talk about a war that everyone else had forgotten. The landing on February 19, 1945, told Braddock everything he needed to know about how different this fight would be. The black volcanic sand swallowed his boots to the ankles with every step. It was not sand the way beaches in the Pacific were sand. It was powdered volcanic rock, fine as talcum, hot enough to burn through boot leather, and it got into everything. Within the first hour on the island, every weapon in the squad was contaminated. Kowalski tried to keep his shotgun clean by wrapping the receiver in cloth, but the particles found their way through every gap, every seam, every place where metal met metal. When he racked the pump action for the first time on shore, the grinding noise made every Marine within earshot flinch. "That sand is not sand," Pulaski said, examining the black residue between his fingers. "It is loose grit, and it is grinding this weapon down from the inside." The volcanic ash was finer than anything they had encountered in the jungle. Mixed with any liquid oil or sweat or rain, it formed a corrosive slurry that ground down moving parts with the patience of a jeweler polishing stone. Pulaski's hard-won maintenance protocols from Guadalcanal did not apply here. The problem was no longer moisture. The problem was microscopic stone particles that turned every mechanism into a grinding mill. He had to start over. Within the first week, Pulaski developed a new set of field procedures tailored to the volcanic environment. Wipe every surface with oil-soaked cloth after each use to create a thin protective film against sulfur corrosion. Fashion covers for the muzzle and ejection port from torn pieces of pack cloth. Develop a 60-second rapid cleaning drill that could be performed between tunnel assaults. The sulfur compounds in the air corroded metal at rates that shocked even the equipment specialists. Braddock's extractor mechanism needed replacement after 10 days on the island. "The swamp taught me about water," Pulaski told his squad. "The volcano is teaching me about acid. Every place has a different lesson, but the answer is always the same: understand the environment, adapt, and never stop cleaning your weapon." But the maintenance challenges were secondary to what Braddock discovered when he studied the Japanese defensive positions. General Kuribayashi had transformed Iwo Jima into something unprecedented in Pacific warfare. There were no Banzai charges, no human wave assaults, no screaming soldiers with fixed bayonets. Instead, there were 11 miles of tunnels connecting more than 1,000 fortified positions, each designed to channel American attackers into corridors barely wide enough for a single man to pass through. The tunnels were reinforced concrete 6 feet high, 4 feet wide, with firing ports, ammunition storage, and ventilation shafts built into the rock. The engagement ranges were 5 to 15 yards. In some tunnels, less than 10 feet. Braddock stood at the mouth of the first tunnel his squad was assigned to clear and felt something click into place inside his mind. A recognition that went beyond tactics or training. This was what Harold had described. Not the jungle of Guadalcanal, not the rain-soaked ridges of the Solomon Islands. This: narrow passages, close quarters, distances measured in arm lengths, the kind of fighting that rifles were too long and too slow to win. The shotgun had been designed for exactly this environment 27 years ago on another continent for another war. And here it was again. Pulaski led the first tunnel assault on March 2nd. The target was a complex housing approximately 30 Japanese defenders connected by a network of concrete passages that had taken months to construct. His 4-man team carried 40 rounds of double-aught buckshot apiece, each shell loaded with 12 pellets capable of devastating effect at point-blank range. Braddock positioned a support team at the tunnel entrance with rifles to prevent any enemy escape or counterattack from behind. Before entering, Pulaski paused at the mouth of the tunnel. The opening was a dark rectangle cut into the volcanic rock framed by rough concrete barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. Warm air flowed out of it like breath from a sleeping animal. The smell was sulfur and earth and something metallic that coated the back of the throat. 30 men in there, Pulaski said to his team. His voice was the same flat Louisiana drawl whether he was ordering breakfast or preparing to walk into the darkest place any of them had ever seen. "Stay behind me. Watch my left shoulder. If I drop, the man behind me steps up. Do not stop moving. Stopping in a tunnel is dying in a tunnel." Stepping into the tunnel was stepping into darkness. The only light came from the flashlight mounted on the barrel of Pulaski's shotgun. The beam cut a narrow cone through air that was hot, dense, and foul with the mingled stench of sulfur cordite and something organic that none of them wanted to identify. The concrete walls reflected every sound. Footsteps became drumbeats. Breathing became wind. The shuffle of a boot on stone echoed from 3 directions at once, making it impossible to tell friendly movement from enemy. Every sense was overloaded and useless at the same time. The first shotgun blast inside the tunnel was an experience that no amount of training could prepare a man for. The sound was not a sound. It was a physical force, a wall of compressed air that slammed into the chest and shook the teeth in the jaw. Pulaski described it later as being punched in both ears simultaneously. The 12-gauge report in a concrete tube 4 feet wide created acoustic shock waves that bounced between the walls and amplified into something that felt like standing inside a bell while someone hit it with a sledgehammer. The effect on the Japanese defenders was immediate. Men who had been positioned behind barriers with clear firing lanes became disoriented, unable to determine where the attack was coming from. as the echoes turned a single shot into what sounded like fire from every direction. The shock bought Pulaski's team 2 to 3 seconds of confusion each time a round was fired. In tunnel combat, 2 seconds was an eternity. But the same acoustic violence battered the attacking Marines. Ears rang for hours after an engagement. Communication became impossible within the first minute. The squad developed hand signals and physical taps on shoulders to coordinate movement because voices were swallowed by the echoing blasts. Pulaski discovered something in the tunnels that exceeded anything the Winchester's designers had imagined. When buckshot struck the concrete walls at an angle, the pellets did not stop. They ricocheted, and in a rectangular tube of reinforced concrete, those ricochets followed predictable paths. A man hiding behind a barrier at the end of a straight passage believed he was safe from direct fire. He was not safe from pellets that bounced off the wall beside him and struck from an angle he never expected. Pulaski began using this deliberately. At every corner, instead of stepping around blind into potential gunfire, he aimed at the concrete wall at a calculated angle and fired. The buckshot bounced around the corner and struck whatever was on the other side. In the bayou, he told his team, "You never walk around a bend in the water without throwing a stone first." Same principle here, except our stones are heavier. The deepest assault came on March 8th. Pulaski led 4 men into an interconnected tunnel system that intelligence estimated held 20 defenders. The concrete passages twisted and branched, some sections lit by dim electric bulbs, powered by Japanese generators, others in complete darkness. The air grew hotter the deeper they went. Sweat ran into eyes and made grips slippery on the pump mechanism. At every junction, Pulaski used the bounce shot. Fire into the wall. Listen for the impact. Move. The rhythm became mechanical aim fire pump. Listen, advance. Behind him, Kowalski covered the rear with his rifle, providing precision fire down the longer straight sections where the shotgun's spread pattern was too wide to be effective. The combined arms technique they had developed on Guadalcanal reached its fullest expression here. Shotgun for the corners and close spaces, rifle for the straightaways. The most dangerous moment came 60 feet underground in a section of tunnel where the electric lights had been shot out and the only illumination was the flashlight on Pulaski's barrel. He rounded a corner and found himself facing 3 Japanese soldiers at the end of a straight section 12 feet away. 12 feet, less than the distance from a pitcher's mound to home plate. Less than the length of a living room. 3 men with rifles already rising their bayonets, catching the thin beam of Pulaski's flashlight and throwing back a glint of silver in the darkness. There was no cover, no room to dodge. The passage was 4 feet wide, and the 3 men filled it shoulder to shoulder. Behind Pulaski, his team could not fire without hitting him. In front of him, 3 bayonets were coming up. Pulaski fired. The blast in the confined space was like a physical blow to every person in the tunnel. The first shot caught 2 of the 3 men. They collapsed into each other, their weapons clattering against the concrete. The third man did not retreat, did not flinch. He lunged forward with his bayonet in a single explosive stride that ate half the distance between them. Pulaski racked the pump. The sound of the action cycling echoed off the walls like a second gunshot. He fired again at 5 feet, close enough to feel the heat from his own muzzle blast reflected off the man's uniform. Close enough that powder residue peppered his own forearms. Close enough that the recoil pushed him back a half step into the Marine behind him. The passage went quiet. The flashlight beam cut through a haze of concrete dust and gun smoke, illuminating 3 bodies in a space barely large enough to hold them. "That is the distance," Pulaski said afterward, his voice carrying the same flat calm it always did, as though he were describing the weather. "Where in the bayou I would use my hands to catch an alligator instead of shooting it." The tunnel complex took 3 hours to clear. When it was over, Pulaski's team emerged into daylight blinking and half-deaf, covered in concrete dust and sweat, carrying empty weapons and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from sustained close-quarters combat, where every heartbeat might be the last. Then the intelligence reports confirmed what Braddock had suspected. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed that Japanese commanders on Iwo Jima had begun redesigning their tunnel network specifically to counter American shotgun tactics. This was not a change in training or procedure. This was a change in construction, infrastructure, concrete and steel, and weeks of labor. The modifications were precise and targeted. First, they extended tunnel lengths beyond 50 yards, forcing American assault teams to cross long open passages where the shotgun's limited range became a liability and defending rifles held the advantage. Second, they installed angled steel plates and zigzag sandbag barriers designed to fragment and disperse buckshot patterns before they could reach defenders. Third, they added sharp turns and right angle bends specifically to prevent the ricochet technique that Pulaski had developed, breaking the straight wall surfaces that made bounce shots possible. The enemy had studied the shotgun's strengths, identified every advantage it offered in tunnel combat, and was physically rebuilding their fortifications to neutralize each one. Tons of concrete, tons of steel, weeks of construction by engineers who should have been reinforcing other positions. Hundreds of man-hours of labor on an island where every pound of concrete had to be shipped through an American naval blockade that sank more supply ships than it let through. All of that effort, all of those resources, all of that precious construction material that could have strengthened 100 other positions, diverted to counter a single weapon. A weapon the American military had nearly thrown in the garbage 3 years earlier. This was enemy validation at its highest possible level. Not frightened prisoners using colorful nicknames. Not tactical documents acknowledging a problem and recommending new procedures. This was the Japanese Imperial Army investing its most precious wartime resources to physically reshape its defenses against one gun. When the enemy pours concrete and bends steel because of what you carry in your hands, that is the most absolute acknowledgement of effectiveness that warfare can produce. There is no higher compliment a weapon can receive than forcing your enemy to rebuild his fortress. But Braddock's squad adapted. They always adapted. For the extended tunnels, they used leapfrog movement, 2 teams alternating between advancing and providing covering fire, never leaving a gap the enemy could exploit. For the fragmentation barriers they employed, breaching round specialized shells loaded with hardened steel projectiles that punched through the obstacles before the assault team moved in. For the sharp angle turns, they threw grenades around corners before switching to shotguns for the final clearance. The arms race between attack and defense continued underground each side, adjusting to the other's innovations in a contest that played out in concrete passages lit by flickering bulbs and choked with dust. By March 15th, the results were beyond dispute. Braddock's squad had participated in 14 separate tunnel assaults with 0 fatalities and 3 minor wounded. Along the same front, rifle-equipped units attacking similar positions averaged 30 to 40% casualties. The contrast was so stark that Lieutenant Colonel Hargrove found himself rationing trench guns among competing units, each claiming operational priority for their particular mission. The weapon that had been nearly discarded had become the most sought-after armament in the Pacific Theater. Years after the war, Earl Braddock went home to West Virginia. He did not go back to the mines. He opened a small gun shop in Charleston, specializing in shotguns, the only thing he truly understood after what he had been through. On the wall behind the counter hung the Winchester Model 97, that had followed him from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. Below it, in a small glass frame, sat Harold's shell casing, the corroded fragment from the Argonne Forest, 1918. Father and sons wore side by side on a wall in a quiet shop on a quiet street. One afternoon in 1962, a Japanese man walked through the door. His name was Takeshi Yamamoto. He was a former Imperial Army soldier, now a businessman running an import-export company in New York. He was looking to buy a hunting shotgun for a trip to Texas with his American business partners. Braddock helped him examine several models. They talked about gauges and barrel lengths and the differences between pump action and semi-automatic mechanisms. It was an ordinary conversation between 2 men who knew firearms, and for a while, that was all it was. Then Yamamoto noticed the Winchester on the wall. He stopped mid-sentence. His hand, which had been resting on the glass counter, went still. He studied the weapon for a long time, the way a man studies something he has heard about but never expected to see. The worn receiver with its blued finish worn silver in patches. The dented heat shield that had protected hands from hot barrels in the tropics. The bayonet lug that had not held a bayonet in 17 years, but still carried the scratches from the last one mounted. He read the small card beneath it that said Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, 1942 to 1945. When Yamamoto spoke again, his voice had changed. Lower. Slower. The businessman was gone. The soldier was speaking. My father was at Peleliu, he said. He survived, though most of his company did not. He never spoke much about the fighting, but he spoke of the Raiju, the thunder gun. He said it was the most frightening weapon he ever faced. Yamamoto paused. Not because of what it did to a man, because you could not hide from it. He said the sound of the pump, that sound of the next round being loaded, was worse than the explosion. Because the explosion meant one shot was finished, but the pump sound meant another was already coming. The shop went very still. 2 men who had been on opposite sides of the largest war in human history stood 3 feet apart across a glass counter connected by a weapon that both their fathers had known, feared, or trusted. Braddock did not ask which unit. He did not ask about casualties or battles or any of the details that civilians think veterans want to discuss. He simply looked at Yamamoto and saw something. He recognized the expression of a man who understood what combat does to the people who survive it. An understanding that transcends language and nationality and the politics that send young men to kill each other on islands they cannot pronounce. He sold Yamamoto a Remington 870 at cost. No markup, no profit. "For your father," Braddock said. Yamamoto bowed his head. Just slightly, the way men do when words are not enough and silence says everything. That evening, after closing the shop, Braddock stood alone behind the counter and looked at the Winchester on the wall. He reached up and took Harold's shell casing from its glass frame. The small piece of corroded metal sat in his palm, warm from the display light. He turned it over, feeling the rough edges that decades of handling had not smoothed. This fragment of brass had traveled from the Argonne Forest in 1918 to a porch in West Virginia, where a dying man told stories no one believed. From that porch into the shirt pocket of a young Marine who carried it without understanding why the way sons carry the things their fathers leave behind, not as relics, but as questions they have not yet learned to ask. Through the jungle of Guadalcanal, where the question was finally answered. Through monsoon rains that nearly destroyed the weapon it came from. Across the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, and into tunnels that smelled like sulfur and death, 60 feet underground in darkness, so complete that the only light was a flashlight on the barrel of a gun Harold would have recognized. And now here in a quiet gun shop in Charleston, where a former enemy's son had confirmed what Harold Braddock always knew. "Remember the shotgun, son? When everything else fails, it won't." Harold had been right. About the shotgun. And about something larger that Earl had spent a lifetime learning to hear, that the things we inherit from our fathers, the stories we half listen to, the objects we carry without knowing their weight, contain truths that only reveal themselves when we arrive at the moments they were meant for. The trench gun went on serving long after Braddock hung his on the wall. In Korea, winter 1950. American Marines at the Chosin Reservoir faced 200,000 Chinese soldiers pouring across frozen hills in waves that dwarfed anything the Pacific had produced. Temperatures dropped to 35 below zero. Rifle actions froze. Bolt mechanisms locked solid in the cold. But the shotgun, with its simpler mechanism and larger tolerances, kept cycling. Once again, at close range and conditions that rendered precision weapons unreliable, the 12-gauge proved itself the most devastating tool a man could carry. In Vietnam, pump-action shotguns cleared jungle trails and village passages at distances that echoed Guadalcanal 30 years later. Marines called them door knockers during house-to-house fighting in Hugh City, 1968, using them for the same purpose Pulaski had pioneered in the tunnels of Iwo Jima, clearing confined spaces where rifles were too long and too slow. And the descendants of the Winchester model. 97. The Remington 87. Oh, the Mossberg 500. The Benelli M4. Continue serving today in urban combat from Baghdad to Kandahar. Every modern combat shotgun carries the DNA of the weapon Harold Braddock fired in a French trench in October 1918, and his son carried through the Pacific 25 years later. The Department of Defense still issues combat shotguns to units tasked with close-quarters operations. The weapon that military planners called obsolete in 1941 remains in active service in 2024, more than a century after it was first designed. The Winchester Model 97 was eventually retired, but its legacy lives in every 12-gauge shell chambered in combat, in every Marine who learns to point instead of aim, in every soldier who understands that the right weapon is not always the newest weapon. Sometimes it is the one that everyone else forgot. Sometimes the most effective tool is the one that has been sitting in a closet for 25 years, waiting for the right hands and the right battlefield to prove what it was always capable of. And sometimes the stories we dismiss as the ramblings of old men's stories told on porches with cheap whiskey and fading voices turn out to be the most important lessons we will ever receive, if we are willing to listen. Pulaski said it best. He said it 4 times across 3 years of war, each time in a different place, each time with a wider meaning than the last. In a training camp on Guadalcanal, teaching skeptical Marines how to hold a weapon they did not trust. In the swamp, you don't aim, you point and you shoot. On a ridge after the first Banzai charge, cleaning his shotgun with the calm of a man who had just finished a day of duck hunting. In the swamp, you don't aim, you point and you shoot. The jungle works the same way. 60 feet underground on Iwo Jima. His ears ringing concrete dust, coating his face, standing over men he had killed at a distance close enough to touch. In the swamp, you don't aim. You point and you shoot. Turns out trenches work the same way too. And one last time sitting on the deck of a transport ship heading home, the war finally over the ocean flat in silver under a sky that held no threat for the first time in 3 years. Pulaski looked at the shotgun resting across his knees, the weapon that had followed him from Louisiana to the bottom of a volcano and back, and said it the final way. In the swamp, you don't aim. You point and you shoot. Turns out the jungle works that way. And the trenches, and the volcano. He paused, looked out at the water. The Pacific stretched in every direction, vast and silver, and finally, for the first time in 3 years, empty of threat. Somewhere beneath that water lay the islands they had fought for, the ridges and tunnels and beaches that had consumed so many young men who would never see home again. And sometimes, Pulaski said, the whole life works that way too. You don't always get to aim. You don't always get to plan. Sometimes you just point yourself in the best direction you can find and you go. He ran his thumb along the receiver of the Winchester one last time. Then he leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the sound of the ocean carry him toward whatever came next.